Next up, Itai Palti, and he'll take us through the looking glass to think about what a city could be if it becomes conscious. Itai, welcome. Thanks for coming.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So, can you tell us just a little bit about yourselves and what you're doing at your lab and at your design studio? I'm really pretty fascinated by your sort of point of view on this.
Thank you. Yeah, so I work at the intersection of architecture and neuroscience, and that has a few implications, both in culture change in the built environment. So how do we change the way we design? How do we change our relationship with space? And on a practical level, also, how do we create the methodologies and the proofs of concepts that there is a different way to design? We specifically use cognitive science, behavioral science, to inform our design process, but also to create a new type of relationship between person and space.
So a new type of relationship, just real quick before we jump into your presentation. What would be a relationship you'd love to see between people and a space?
Well, I think the way that we build currently is that we see a space or a place as an end product of a design process. And I find that problematic because really the relationship of person and space begins when it's when there are people there using it, inhabiting the spaces. And therefore, the work that I do and we do at Hume and the Center for Conscious Design also tries to rethink this relationship, because we understand that it's the use of the space and the evolution of the space over time which has a really significant effect on people's health, well-being, productivity, all the things we want to talk about. And it's very strange that actually people involved in design leave these spaces.
Isn't that weird?
They're on there. Right. So through the looking glass, I'm starting off with this idea that we are able to see the world in a different way to what we're used to seeing. And part of this is built out of our understanding of cognition in humans. In that, in the past, we as a scientific community thought that the brain was the kind of central engine that was not so connected to the rest of our body or the outside world and so on. Over time, we've understood that we can look at cognition much more fluidly. So think about the fact that you use your telephone to remember things, to speak to people. You might put your sunglasses on the door handle to remind yourself to go out. And we use buildings as our tools and also as a way to extend our intent. So think about how you look around your space. How did you position different things around your space? That's your intent having a manifestation on the space. And everywhere you look around you, including places that you don't control, are representations of someone's intent or groups of people's intent to shape an experience. And so this connection between mind, body, space, and the way that these things are fluid gives us a different way to look at and assess our relationship with place. What is this space around us? What does it mean? What is it trying to do? And we recognize that design is a decision-making process, meaning each of the points of decisions in that process is a hypothesis that we say we believe doing X will have Y effect, or probability that there is a Y effect. So I am saying, let's redefine architecture, and I've taken this famous saying, architecture is frozen music. I'm saying architecture is frozen intent. And through that looking glass, we can start understanding what spaces are and what design is, everywhere you look around it. So intent to welcome, intent to include people, for example, intent to keep out as well. The intent isn't always good. Intent to empower. So this is an example, a personal example from my city, Tel Aviv. We have Rabin Square in Tel Aviv, which was designed within the brief with the intent to house over at least 40,000 protesters in front of City Hall. That's intent to empower democracy and intent to empower the voice of the people.
Wow.
The space is empty in the day-to-day. but it has to be empty for it to be able to house that volume of demonstration, large amount of people. Take Trafalgar Square as another example. The two fountains that you see on the left and right, they're huge fountains that take up a large amount of floor space. They were installed there in 1840 something, 5 I think, to repress mass gatherings. So take up more space in your public square means less people can gather there. And so here is a hidden intent to repress. It's hidden within the beauty of a fountain, but the intent is something else. And so you use this lens to look at your city. When you walk around the city and think about how it affects you. First of all, as we see it through our scientific lens, cognition. So how does space affect our cognition? That's our attention capacity, our creative thinking, the way we might empathize even. And how does it affect our metacognition, where it relates to our identity, our sense of belonging, our knowing of ourselves within the city and within our context. And the city has the power to do all these things. Conscious Cities was based on the idea of The Right to the City by Henry Lefebvre, and this is a really nice take by David Harvey on it, saying far more than the individual liberty to access urban resources, it is a right to change ourselves by changing the city. And I think this right is something that we need to ask whether we are exercising that right or whether we are being given the option to exercise our right. Whose intent are we living in? When you go into the street, is it your intent? Is it the intent of the community around you? Or is it the intent of a small number of people who are making decisions in perhaps somewhere divorced from your reality? I'm not going to say what my opinion is, but let's say there's a variety of these situations. Part 2, making the invisible visible. The power of science as it currently is with technology to allow us to understand what a space creates as part of an experience and measure it as well. So we look at spaces that we love and we go to. Their intent was to create a sense of curiosity, a sense of awe, perhaps bring people together. These are buildings that we flock to but would not be commissioned right in today. They weren't probably commissioned that much in that period as well, and this is Gaudi in Barcelona. Why? Because how can you commission something that you can't measure? So we commission things and we think about things in the way that we can measure. So streets, when we put the metric of success as movement as an example, we strip it and we engineer anything out of it that doesn't serve that purpose. And so we strip our streets and engineer serendipity out of them because they might be lowering that metric that we've attached to it, which is how many cars speed through it, how many bikes, how many whatever. But the choice of metrics creates an evolution of a space. So you look at how airplane seats in front of our eyes over the years get narrower and narrower. Sorry, that slide went through. But the reason for it is that the metric attached to it is number of passengers or profits, and therefore the space evolves over time according to that. Sometimes we can't help it. We're given all sorts of ways to measure the world and speak to others about it objectively, and that affects the way that we look at what is possible, what's possible to measure, what's possible to affect, what's possible to talk about. Many people might think science is there to replace design. When we talk about science-informed design, it's not. Science cannot design. What it can do is shift design from efficient to effective. And that means getting rid of old metrics that create a mechanical relationship with space and creating new metrics that speak to the human experience and human well-being. So we're adding human metrics to all the existing metrics that we already have, which sometimes represent, but often don't represent the human experience. And human metrics can be many different things: behavioral, physiological, cognitive, metacognitive. These are all things that we are able to draw from scientific research to give us context of how does this fit within a design process. Also a scale on the level from individual to society, as you can see here. Part 3, what's in a city? So here I'm going to take these two kind of ideas. First of all, the lens to look at architecture as intent. Secondly, this way of measuring the human experience and how that's going to affect us. And I'm going to start with a very simple example, which is, how does knowing about the content of food affect our consumption? And we know that most of us in our lives also saw the period where there was no indication of what's in food, and we know what happened when we started seeing the numbers. Our consumption changed. And so this is what's happening to architecture. We are starting to put numbers to the invisible, and it's starting to change what people expect of spaces. The three articles on the right are related to the Conscious Cities movement, which I lead, and change is there to change the way we see the built environment. The third one, the final one on the left, is interesting because sick building syndrome is something that once you give a name to it, you're able to talk about it, you're able to even sue people for its effects, and therefore it has very direct effect on consumption. And so you say, okay, when we know what we're actually experiencing in the way that we know what we're eating, we might think differently about space. That works also in the other way. So information that comes in about the health benefits of nature is starting to say to us, nature affects us in a positive way, restores our attention capacity, brings calm to our lives, perspective, relaxation, and we start attributing those things to nature because of what science is telling us. And so we start saying, okay, so nature is good for us, therefore I must surround myself with nature and everything that comes from nature. But it raises a question, because it almost ignores the fact most of the time that we live and experience space through changes of social contracts. We are in the city and we are in the street, and the social contract there is efficiency and movement and business, and if that's not what you're doing, then it's not right. It's not right to speak to a stranger in the street, because who has time for that? You're in the street. It's about efficiency. But studies that talk about parks and people's behaviors in parks and nature talk about pro-social behavior. Attributing, in my opinion, pro-social behavior to greenery in itself, I'm not sure is completely robust, because it ignores this fact that there is a social contract of when you are in nature, you are enjoying yourself, you are relaxed, you speak to people, you are not working, and you are not taking part in this machine of efficiency that the streets are projecting. And so we look at this approach commodifies nature and says, you go to nature in the same way that you take medicine. Go to nature for X amount of time and you will get this benefit. These are just some dialogues between city and nature that I like. So I'm going to give an example of what it means to talk about the nature of nature and how we can embed it into our cities. This is an example in Tel Aviv. In this case, it's a park. The next example I'm going to give is almost devoid of nature. But what's interesting about this park is that, yes, it's green. We can call it nature in some ways, but it's actually the serendipity and the exploration and the events that are designed into the space that create the same law of nature. That means, for example, every day the fountain overflows, a small stream runs through the whole park and ends in a pond. So the kids love to go there at 5 p.m. every day and see this thing. When they were building it, they hid all sorts of treasures within the soil so that kids could explore and dig and find them. And I even have one myself, even though I'm not a kid. Well, not age-wise.
I love this idea. It's kind of like it's like a treasure hunt, you know, built in, and it means that it's the opposite of what you said earlier, right? That architecture is frozen intent. It almost is like the kids actually bring intent to it by digging, they change the architecture. I love this. Wow.
Right. They enact it. So the theory of enactivism in architecture is that it's also the person that acts on affordances and creates the opportunity and creates the experience. And so you could say it's not frozen intent, but it's absolutely the intent of the designer to create the nature of nature and for children to enjoy exploration, and something that doesn't exist in the street. You do not explore in the street. You do not find serendipity in the street. And this is a question, right? So this is a project I worked on called Urban Thinkscape in Philadelphia, and we worked with two child psychologists, Kathy Hirsch-Pasek, Roberta Goningoff, who pioneered the science of playful learning. So child development works better through play in many different ways. And so we translated the science of that, and we created a space for play, exploration, interactions between caregiver and child, at a spot where people wait for the bus. So we take places where you know, a parent and child be sitting on their smartphones and not talking, and we give them the opportunity to use that time to interact and explore and so on. So here is something that, yes, there are plants in there, but the nature of nature here in terms of its serendipity, its playfulness, its exploration is there in design and part of the urban fabric. And so
I love this. Yeah. Well, and it also, you make me think of, you know, you started with through the looking glass, you know, how do we go into a different space? And now you're kind of wrapping with the nature of nature. And it feels like you're talking about human nature as well, right? And not just this kind of artificial idea of pro-social behavior coming out of a park or something, but really kind of allowing human nature to shape the intent. And I wrote down inactivism. I thought that was a fascinating word. Like, I've never heard that before, but
yeah.
That you enact, you know, you actually, it reminds me a little bit of tactical urban prototyping, you know, which is something that happens a lot in San Francisco.
Right.
Sometimes, you know, surprisingly. So let's wrap this up. Where are you at in terms of, you know, things that you'd like to share, maybe a last slide or two, and also what do you want to provoke the attendees? You know, what kind of either provocation or pilot or experiment would you love to run, and what do you see as an opportunity for a sort of a wise city or a thriving city?
Okay, so the project that I showed you, we were solving a problem. It is in a promise zone in Philadelphia, where children come from disadvantaged neighborhoods and enter education with a word gap. We understood there was an opportunity to use the space to solve this problem, and we carried out a method which also included impact assessment to prove the worth of this investment on social return. So how does it affect child development and so on? I think we have a lot of issues that we need to solve in our cities. You can talk about what COVID has done, but to me, those issues, the issues are the very same issues that were there before COVID. Loneliness, problems in belonging, lack of community, lack of trust. And I think that as a provocation, I will say, all of these things may be a result of the way that we treat our shared spaces as a place for efficiency and not for experience and solving all the issues we want. And so I want to ask about, can we look at what we are drawn to in nature, curiosity, exploration, and so on? Can we embed that into our streets in a way that is both effective for the experience of the people and affects their health and well-being, and also create the economic models that show that this is a worthwhile way to reshape our cities?
I love it.
And so I'll finish off on this quote from Einstein to say, now that we're starting to count the right things, let's use it. And that's probably my message here, my provocation.
I love it. Well, thank you so much. You know, Itai, you've given me like a ton of ideas, right? From inactivism to moving from effective to or efficient to effective, to this notion of let's not just do this kind of artificial apply, parks are where you have fun, period, this is where you get things done, kind of thing. But also this notion that a place just begins to be the architecture when it's actually used, when it starts to accrete memory. And I loved I loved having Spock there, because I think he's our kind of icon for the tension between trying to be logical and count everything, but also,
you got it.
yeah.
I love it when people notice that, because it's a hidden fault in the slide, because Spock is rational, so most of those things don't count for him. Usually I give it as a quiz, but you spotted it without.
Yeah, well, and I think, I always thought of Kirk, Spock, and McCoy as being just different people inside of your head. Kirk was this sort of super passionate, come on, let's go. And, Spock was rational. And then McCoy was the kind of smart, smart aleck, I guess.
Yeah.
So who would you love to work with? If you could have a different kind of discipline, or a different, somebody that's not in your world, but you think is really important, like the kinds of other teammates, other disciplines you'd love to participate in a pilot, you'd love to do a prototype with, around kind of this idea of a different kind of a street, for example.
Yeah, so I think the type of people I work with and want to continue working with are those in organizations that can pivot towards an evidence base and towards a different way of understanding effectiveness. That might mean redefining what productivity is. It might mean redefining what the street is for, redefining what a community is. And we have a way to translate all this scientific knowledge into very useful information, and to use technology to create a much more direct dialogue that can have a huge effect on how people perceive their agency and relationship with space, and also with the other people who inhabit those spaces.
I love it. Well, thank you so much, Itai, and I'm looking forward to kind of what people come up with and how this evolves. This conference is just sort of step one of the dream that I think Nicole and Mistletoe and the organizations that are helping this are coming forward with. I'd love to see some actual prototyping come out of it. So I'm looking forward to see what people come up with.
Absolutely. Thank you. It's been great. I'm looking forward to seeing what happens in this initiative. I think it's a great initiative, and I'm interested to take
Well, and thanks for inspiring us with this idea of a movement around conscious cities. I think it's kind of beautiful.